Yesterday, Satchidar in his presentation mentioned at the start of the Anapanasati Sutta the so-called preliminaries. So finding a secluded place in a hut at the foot of a tree and so on, finding a seat, sitting cross-legged and so forth. And I certainly am guilty of this. I don't think we give enough attention to the preliminaries. So, for instance, right now, are we aware of our seat, aware of our body, aware of why we're here, and so forth? And it's important, I think, to try to remain in touch, especially with embodied awareness. Even if we're listening to something didactic, getting that sense of being present to embodied awareness. I recently saw a film about a blind rock climber who was leading an ascent up a big, what's called a sea stack at the north of Scotland, called the Old Man of Hoy. And it was impressive because without sight, he's completely in his body. He's got that very fine-tuned awareness of his body, of tactile sensation under his fingers, under his feet, and you just got the sense that he could feel his way because of this terrific awareness. So it's something we can develop, and in a way, if we're in this moment is a preliminary to the next moment, and so on. Each moment, in a way, can take us to the next moment, particularly with embodied awareness. And we'll start. If you don't want to listen to music, you can just sort of turn your sound off. But I just thought I'd show you this in action with a pianist called Olga Sheps, and it's in a moment in the Chopin Piano Concerto, the first one. And you'll see, so she's very engaged. It's kind of wild, passionate, romantic music. And then the music turns a corner and brings us to the second slow, incredibly beautiful theme. But you can see that she's anticipating this completely in her body, not only with her ear, but in her body. She's sort of setting up, in a way, the preliminaries for the next section of the piece. So let me see if I can find it. If you want to look at that again, I hope you all saw that, how her body just seems to melt in advance to the new material. So, yeah, let's just be present in our body, in our hearts, in our minds. The fifth section of the sevenfold puja that we practice begins, I rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings, through which they obtain rest with the end of suffering. So I rejoice with delight. Such a beautiful phrase. And I rejoice in your all being here with us together, practicing. I rejoice in my good Dharma friends, Shatayu, Satchada, Amala, for their participation and personally for their inspiration, which is deep for me, I must say. I've known them all for a long time, and they're great sources of strength for me, I must say, their own practice. And I rejoice with humility and delight in just in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, which of course have immeasurably changed my life, enhanced my life. Today's Brahma Vihara is Mudita Bhavana. So Mudita is usually translated as sympathetic joy, taking the delight in the happiness of others, or rejoicing in the good fortune of others. Buddhaghosa translates it as altruistic joy, which is rather good. And like karuna, like compassion, it comes about when metta, when loving kindness encounters another person's happiness, another person's joy, another person's good fortune. And it's in a way very close to this whole practice of rejoicing in merits. You might say rejoicing in the merits is a sort of active extension of the practice of mudita. And probably many of you have participated in a session of rejoicing in somebody's merits. Maybe they're leaving for something, or maybe they've just become a mitra, and we rejoice in their merits. And it's, as we know, an incredibly pleasurable activity. It's just it somehow fills one with delight, with happiness, with a sense of ease, even. And it seems that we're clear about the fact that when our own hearts and minds are in an upbeat mood, are spacious, are with friendliness, with metta, it's easier to function, it's easier to be just going through the course of our life. Of course, on the other hand, we know all too well, I know all too well, that when I'm feeling a bit closed down, a bit maybe irritated, the same world looks rather different. So, in short, all beings want to be happy. They don't want to suffer. And as we all know too well, just too well, quite often our pursuit of happiness gets us into places we would rather not be, into places of suffering, in fact. And even though we might know perfectly well, intellectually at least, why this is happening, we can't seem to help ourselves. And so the the practices of the Brahma Viharas are encouraging us to create our lives themselves as abodes of metta, of karuna, mudita, and upeksha, so that more and more we don't go searching in dubious places for states of happiness. And it's quite good to ask ourselves, since I've been practicing meditation, since I've been practicing Buddhism, do I feel a bit more at ease in my life, a bit happier, a bit more light-hearted, and so on? And I think it's true that Buddhists should just be happy in general. I mean, yes, we obviously experience suffering, we experience grief, sadness, and so on. But in general, the course of our lives should be taking us to happier states. I remember quite early on when I first heard, I think it's in the lecture series on the Noble Eightfold Path by Sangharakshita, and he speaks about when he first led a Wesak celebration, celebrating the enlightenment of the Buddha in the United Kingdom. So probably, I don't know, 1964 or something. And he cracked a few jokes, but he said the audience just looked very somber, as if they were at a funeral. And he said, well, this is very strange. I thought we should be happy that we're celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. But actually, and he said eventually a few people did sort of begin to smile. But he just commented that our lives as practicing Buddhists should be quite, in a way, light-hearted. Of course, it's a serious business. Nevertheless, can we be more happy? And at the beginning of the Triratna Vandana, which we've been chanting in the mornings, the Buddha, one of the epithets of the Buddha is Sukata, that the happily attained, the happily attained. And in the third section, a salutation to the Sangha, the Arya Sangha is described as happily proceeding is the Sangha of those who hear the Buddha, happily proceeding. And at the very beginning of the Dhammapada, these first phrases that I'm sure you all know quite well: experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like the shadow that never departs. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows. And there's a section later on in the Dhammapada: happy indeed we live, friendly amid those who hate. Among those who hate, we dwell free from hate. Happy indeed we live, healthy amid the sick. Among those who are sick, we dwell free from sickness. Happy indeed we live, content amid the greedy. Among those who are greedy, we dwell free from greed. Happy indeed we live, we for whom there are no possessions. Feeders on rapture shall we be, like the gods of brilliant light. So when we meditate, having done our preliminaries, I seem to have trouble with that word, preliminaries, we begin to meditate, and I think it's a good practice to look for sources of joy, sources of contentment, of happiness, of even physical well-being. You know, meditation is something that's often not easy, and so it's likely that the more we enjoy it, the more we're going to want to do it. It's quite normal. So you know, there's this need in a way to find interest and pleasure, sort of skillful pleasure in the things we do, the things we want to do, in our aspirations. So for the last sort of 2.5, 3 months, for the first time consistently, I've been and not for very long necessarily, but I've been on a daily basis contemplating death. And you might be thinking, oh, death is a strange thing to be talking about when talking about mudita. And I've been doing this because I was doing a sort of course, you might call it, with the monk that that Satyadar referenced yesterday, Analia, who's a German monk who lives in Barre, Massachusetts. And I thought rather significantly, he at one point he said, if there's one meditation I encourage people to do above all others, it's contemplation of death. So, wow. For a guy of his experience, so this is quite a significant thing to say. So I sort of took him at his word. And I remember once, a long time ago, somebody told me about an order member who was also trying to remind himself to contemplate death on a daily basis. And apparently in his bedroom he'd painted above the ceiling in huge letters, "I am going to die." So that the first thing he'd see when he would wake up was with this little phrase, "I am going to die," and that would be the beginning of his day. You know? Well, perhaps we don't have to be that extreme, or perhaps we do. Apparently Analia himself likes to sleep in a coffin. Anyway, I've noticed it's quite significant, I think. Well, they're still young in a way, 2.5, 3 months. But I have noticed that my sort of occasional way of taking myself a bit too seriously has been easing, has been sort of diluting it, which is a good thing. I've noticed myself being much less sort of concerned with how things are when they don't meet my expectations, or when they sort of don't go my way, or when, like this morning, some raisins fell onto our rather dusty kitchen floor, for instance. Right, so, oh, there they go. It's not the end of the world. And this is curious. And it's certainly for me worth a lot of contemplation. Why is this happening? Why does Analia recommend this so strongly? Why does a daily reminder of my mortality, my impermanence, lead to, in a way, a more light-hearted, happier sensibility? And I think surely it's because it's leading me a bit more closely to, well, how things really are. It's clear I'm mortal. It's clear I'm going to die. I could die tomorrow. But of course, as we know, most of the time we'd rather not think of that. We'd rather sort of, well, I know it's true, but maybe I'll think about it tomorrow. You know. And I think when we're living closer, I think we've all had this experience, when we're living closer to how things really are impermanent. They don't last. They can't give us lasting satisfaction, and so on. Dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. When we're in touch with these realities, I think life is just somehow easier. And not only is it easier for us, it's easier to see that that's possible in other people as well. There's this sort of external dimension to these understandings. And yeah, and I've certainly noticed this. I've also for some time been practicing more than usual than I had in the past, the six element practice, in which we see, in a way, the same sort of conundrum. We see that the elements that make up our experience, so earth element, water element, fire element, wind element, and so on, they don't really somehow belong to us. Of course, we experience them as being us, but in the end, they're insubstantial. And so my attempts to grasp and hold on to these things are A, futile, and B, lead to my own suffering. And when we can begin to embrace these realities, it's likely, or more likely, well, I'd say it's actually likely, even if not definitely, there's the case that happiness, more contentedness will arise. So in other words, in these Brahma Viharas, there is, they are in a way insight practices, wisdom practices. And this is the case, we've all done the Metta Bhavana. And, there's this element of other, of going beyond ourselves, of seeing that we are interconnected with our good friend, our neutral person, our difficult person, and so on, and then with all beings. And each time we can go a little bit beyond ourselves. Like, for instance, when we rejoice in merits, in somebody else's good fortune, in somebody else's happiness, that means we're going a little bit beyond our own ego, and that I believe in itself is a cause for rejoicing in our own abilities. Each time, it might be very small. It is true that eventually the bucket fills up, drop by drop. It fills. We should be happy with these little drops. And Satyarthaka mentioned this yesterday. We're trying to get, in a way, more invested in other people than in ourselves. Identify more with others' suffering, with others' happiness as a practice. So I thought we'd just spend a couple of minutes practicing this. Just do a little sort of mini meditation. So if you close your eyes, if you like. Know that we're here, seated in our body. And we can bring to mind someone we know. They could be a good friend, a spouse, a sibling, a son, daughter, mother, father, friend. And begin to focus on at least three positive qualities, one by one, that they possess. Skillful qualities. Could be their generosity, their helpfulness, their patience, their courage. And spend a bit of time enjoying the feeling of their qualities. Just trying to rest for a few moments in those qualities of our friend or whoever it is, delighting in those beautiful qualities. And we can ask ourselves, how does this feel for us when we bring these qualities to mind? How does it feel? And where do we feel it? What part of our own body? And perhaps if we feel it mostly in our heart center or our belly, we can imaginatively extend this physical feeling of delight to other parts of our body. Can our hands feel delightful? Our feet, neck and head, full of delight for this person's qualities. And again, just tuning into this sort of shared delight in our body, in our hearts, and in this person's good qualities. So like all the Brahma Viharas, Mudita has far enemy and a near enemy. The far enemy being the sort of opposite quality, and usually we see the opposite as being something like envy, competitiveness, maybe resentment. So we hear of someone we know maybe of having had a certain success, and it's a bit hard to admit to, isn't it, that that there might initially just a very small flicker of envy, or how come I didn't get that recognition, whatever it might be. I certainly experienced that, and then you sort of catch yourself, oh man, I still have work to do here, right? And of course there's comparison, and in a way it's quite normal. Yeah, we're not sort of bodhisattvas quite yet, at least I'm not anyway. So, so okay, I've been doing this for years, and how come they're doing such and such, right? But we do want to be aware of it, and I think it can only be, that sort of thing, comparisons, these little resentments, whatever. In the end, can only be overcome by metta, by our own cultivation within ourselves, of sort of the equanimity that arrives eventually with a metta-full existence. And the near enemy of mudita is I know the Kamalashila, I think he calls it vicarious satisfaction. So sort of when we bask in the glow of another's glory, kind of thing, sort of in a way, hero worship, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And depending on the circumstance, it's not a bad thing to emulate the positive qualities of another person. I teach. One of the things I do is I teach violin and viola, and I quite often tell my students, well, look, listen to such and such recording. It's that poem, whoever it might be. Oh, just try to copy their sound. It's great. This was the way. Of course, in the Renaissance times, that painters were taught to paint. They just copied their masters, and if you like Leonardo, you eventually outdid him and got chucked out of the workshop. Yeah. So this near enemy. I think we if we just recognize, oh well, okay, this person. I mean, fantastic. How I'd love to be like that. Instead of sort of pretending we are like that vicariously, we just okay. I'll just actually can I myself develop some of those same qualities. And Shadayu talked about this notion of cultivation, called bhavana, means cultivating. And he talked about this idea, which I hadn't heard for a while, this idea of spiritual bypassing. In other words, if I remember right, he gave the example of opening a packet of tomato seeds, and he said, well, where are the tomatoes? Right. But actually we just need to plant these seeds, do the right things, cultivate them, water them, give them the correct soil, the correct sunlight, and so on, or the correct position so they can get sunlight. And nature will do the rest. So cultivation, which I remember when I first encountered Buddhism, this was like, what's the word I'm looking for? It was miraculous, this idea that we could cultivate ourselves. I remember when I was a student in London, on BBC Radio there was this series called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they made it into a movie series, I think, which I didn't see. But and there's this android, Marvin, the paranoid android, and he would sort of shuffle about, at least on the radio, shuffle about, and he'd sort of stop this android, and presumably with his head down, he'd sort of say, "I'm so depressed." See, they shuffled some more and did it. "I'm so depressed." Marvin, the paranoid android. And I remember, in my 20s, I was much like that. I just get quite depressed, quite sort of down. Oh, life was so difficult. And then I'd be the opposite. I'd be like wildly ecstatic and was going up. And I just thought that was completely normal to be up and down, in the depths and in the heights, from literally 1 minute to the next. That was just my life. I thought that was life, right? And then I encounter this idea in the Buddha's path of, we can actually cultivate our emotions. We can actually change these aspects. So I can become more compassionate, more joyful, more kind, more patient, more generous, and so on. These are things that we actually develop. This was really fantastic. And who wouldn't want to do that? Okay, it takes some work and some patience. So, what are the ways, and it's something to reflect on deeply, what are the ways that we can cultivate mudita, that we can cultivate in a way our own happiness? I don't actually think we can cultivate happiness directly. We can create the conditions by which it's very likely contentment and happiness will arise. I quoted the beginning of the Dhammapada. So, leading a life in which more and more we don't have any regrets, which means leading a life of ethical stability and purity. You might say that's maybe the basic step, the basic cultivation. Presumably, if it's the opening verse of the Dhammapada, that's quite significant. I think another thing is just spending time with people, with friends who themselves embody these qualities, who embody their own efforts to practice a more ethical life, to be more patient, more kind, and so on. I don't know if any of you know, he's not here, so I can talk about him. Who know Viduma? Now, whenever I spend Viduma, I'm fortunate that Viduma is my Kalyana Mitra, and even when I think about Viduma, I become more content, because to me he embodies such a tender heart, such easy helpfulness. And so naturally, when I get to spend time with Viduma, that rubs off on me, and it's beautiful. We can rejoice, as we've been saying, in other people's merits. We can practice gratitude. It's a very good thing to do. Yes, life is full of many difficulties, no question, full of a lot of suffering. At the same time, amidst all this, there are things to be quite grateful for. We can reflect and rejoice in the growth of others. I'm fond of saying this. Sangharakshita once said It was at the ordination, or just after the ordination of a woman, I think in Australia. And he said, there are major miracles and there are minor miracles. Minor miracles when things like turning water into wine happen. A major miracle is when we witness somebody changing their lives. So I think that's something to reflect on and rejoice upon. And, well, we can practice the Brahma Viharas. We can live more and more in these abodes, in these divine abodes, these immeasurables. And, yeah, we can keep making sincere efforts just to let go into the Dharma, in a way, into the way things really are, which sometimes is difficult. Sometimes, I see somebody's success and I catch that little bit of envy. That's oh dear, So sometimes it's quite difficult to turn towards these things we'd rather not turn towards. But I really believe that in that difficulty, because there's truth in it, there's also rejoicing possible. That these two can coexist, and that they in a way must coexist. And that again is the sort of wisdom element of these practices. That we're trying to do our best, minute by minute, day by day, to be less concerned from an ego point of view and more concerned from an other point of view. And that, in the end, I think that's what brings the greatest happiness, the greatest contentment, the greatest peacefulness. So, yeah, we'll spend a little time we'll do the meditation, the Mudita Bhavana. So the Mudita Bhavana follows a very similar course as the Karana Bhavana. So in the first stage, we develop metta towards ourselves, that current of metta. Then in the second stage, we think about someone who seems to be particularly positive, happy. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone we know particularly well, but someone we know has really good basis in a way of skillful happiness. So we bring them to mind. And direct this metta towards them. And just pay attention, particularly in our felt sense, how this seems to then transform itself, this metta, into appreciative happiness. In the third stage, we bring to mind our good friend, and we think of their positive qualities, bring to mind times when they were happy, joyful, contented. Bring metta to them. Then is the neutral person. So we don't know them well, but we can imagine that they have the capacity. We know they have the capacity to be happy. And so we bring metta to that quality. The difficult person, we know too that they experience happiness, they experience joy. And one thing to possibly do is to try to see this person's joy through the eyes of one of their good friends. Then in the final stage, which some people call breaking the barriers, equalizing, so bringing them all to mind, and then feeling that same metta, encountering happiness, encountering joy, and then beginning to let that expand, let that radiate out more and more into the world, towards all living beings, beyond the world, maybe even beyond the solar system, maybe even into other universes, where there are surely other living beings who are joyful. So we'll practice for about 25 minutes. Then there'll be just a little time for some questions, and then of course at 4 p.m. If you want to show up, of course it's totally optional. If you have any more questions about Mudita or about the practices in general, feel free to come. Mudita Bhavana. So firstly, tuning into that current of metta within ourselves. That current of love, of kindness, tenderness, gentle appreciation for ourselves. So bring to mind so-called boon companion, a person who is full of joy, full of happiness, who seems to radiate those qualities quite easily. And we bring metta towards this person, towards their qualities. And just noticing if mudita, the sympathetic joy, is delighting in this person's happiness, arises within us. Just letting it happen quite naturally. It seems to be faint or even not yet apparent. It's fine. With practice it will emerge. We bring to mind a good friend. And looking directly at their positive qualities, their positive attributes, their joy, their happiness. we bring metta to them and to these qualities. And seeing if we can let the experience develop deep in the body, deep in our hearts. We bring to mind the neutral person, someone we don't know particularly well. Perhaps there's one thing we notice about them that we can rejoice in. Perhaps they seem to be naturally helpful. Or perhaps it's their smile. We're bringing metta to these qualities. we bring to mind how a difficult person, how a challenging person, we know they experience joy and happiness. Doing our best to appreciate that. Perhaps stepping into the shoes of a friend who knows and sees that more clearly than we do. So taking our metta to those qualities. And with this person in particular, staying attentive to embodied awareness, doing our best not to get caught up in stories, just letting our metta touch this person's joy and happiness. So we bring to mind 4 or 5 people doing our best to equalize experience of directing metta towards their happiness, their joy, their delight. May we all be full of joy. May our happiness increase. And beginning to expand our field of metta, our field of mudita. Beings close to beings further away. Wherever I encounter joy, happiness, delight, may I too feel joy, happiness and delight for them. May the field of my metta, of my mudita, of my own delight in others' delight be immeasurable.